Our next speaker is renowned Dr. Robert McGee. We're all excited for him to speak as one of our keynotes. He has a ton of information. He's been at this for a very long time, and so we're excited about it. His presentation. Dr. McGee is has an illustrious academic and professional career. He presently is accounting professor at Fayetteville State University. Over the years, he's earned 23 different academic degrees, including 13 doctorates from universities in the United States and 4 European countries. Dr. McGee has been involved in various studies which have ranked him #1 in the world in both accounting ethics and business ethics scholarships. And he's published over 60 books and more than 1,000 scholarly papers. He notes here that among his many credentials, that he's a world champion Taekwondo and Tai Chi champion. I could go on, but I won't. Please join me in a warm, warm welcome for Dr. Robert McGee.
I'll try not to trip coming up the stairs like our beloved president. Yeah, right. Well, thank you for inviting me here. And this is actually the best Islamic finance conference in North America. So, because it's the first. And actually, I don't know much Arabic, but when I lived in Bosnia, I lived in Sarajevo for a while, and after the Yugoslav wars, that became a Muslim city, more or less. It seemed like at the end of every other sentence, they would say, Inshallah. So I know some Arabic. And I've incorporated Arabic into my accounting classes as well. I now use Arabic numerals. Yeah, it's a big improvement over the Latin stuff, the Roman numerals that we used to use. So, but anyway, the reason I'm here, I know almost nothing about the ethics of tax evasion in Islam. All I know is what I read from papers that were published in the English language. So what I'll do, I'll give you a brief introduction. I'll tell you all I know. It'll only take a few minutes to tell you all I know. And then you can start listing all the mistakes that I made, all the inconsistencies, whatever. I'm open. Hopefully, you'll give me some good feedback so that I can improve my writing in the future, because I know there are gaps in it. I've been criticized for my publications on Islamic ethics relating to tax evasion. So now you can clear that up for me. So in the literature, I went back, based on this Catholic guy, Martin Crowe. He wrote a dissertation in 1944 on your duty to pay just taxes. It was based mostly on the Catholic literature. He went back 500 years. A lot of that literature was in the Latin language, which means nobody knew about it. So he gave us a summary, which introduced us to all that 500 years of Catholic literature. And he found that the arguments that justified tax evasion, there were basically 3 views: that tax evasion is either never ethical, or always ethical, or sometimes ethical. And you'd think that would pretty much cover everything. But there's actually a 4th view that he didn't really get into. In some cases, the argument has been made that there's a moral obligation to evade taxes. And that goes back to some European history, just war theory, when different European states were fighting against each other. And if you're contributing taxes to support an unjust war, the argument goes that there's a moral obligation not to pay those taxes. And during the Vietnam War in the United States, some people protested by not filing their taxes, or they filed their taxes and took 1 billion people as dependents so that they'd get a refund. And of course, they got caught on audit and they had to pay. But they made a moral statement by saying that. And so I'll discuss the Islamic view of these 4 types of arguments that have been used in the English language Islamic literature. First of all, the view that evasion is never ethical. It's either because there's a duty to God, or a duty to the state, or a duty to other taxpayers, because if you don't pay your fair share, whatever that is, then nobody can agree on what fair share is. But if you don't pay your fair share, it means somebody else has to pay more. So those are the three main arguments that have been given to advance the position that tax evasion is never ethical. And there are all kinds of counter-arguments that I could make if I had 3 hours, but I don't. So let's go over the next one. Some people, a small minority of people, say that tax evasion is always ethical, and the reason they give for that is because, like, theft is the taking of property without the owner's consent, and the government takes money without your consent sometimes because you don't give consent. Of course, there's a whole other argument there that if you're living in a country, you consent because you didn't move. That's one reason that's been given to justify that. But they say because it's a taking of property without consent, it's basically just theft by another name, and that there's no moral duty to pay a thief. That would be the argument that tax evasion is always ethical. And then the argument that was given in most of the Catholic literature over the last 500 years is that tax evasion is frowned upon, but sometimes it's ethical. And the main reasons they gave for that is because you don't have an unlimited duty to the government. You have some duty, but it's never 100%. And so there are some limits. The duty to pay is more than zero, but less than 100%. In the Catholic literature and some non-Catholic literature, another argument that's been given is that the inability to pay. If you're a poor person, or if you're fairly rich, but you have more expenses than you do income, then maybe you could be justified in not paying. Or if tax rates are too high. In the United States after World War II, the top tax rate was over 90%. Some people would say that that's too much, and that there's no moral duty to pay 92%. And if the government is corrupt or tyrannical, and one argument that was used in the literature is that if you're a Jew living in Nazi Germany, do you really have a moral obligation to pay taxes to Hitler? Maybe if you're living in another country, like the one that some people call Israel and some people call Palestine, that one, you know, I've heard it both ways. I mean, when I lived in Sarajevo, there was a map on the wall, a map of the world, and they didn't have Israel listed. They said Palestina or occupied Palestine. And so there's an argument there. What if you're a Palestinian living in that geographic location? Is there a moral duty to pay taxes to the government? Some people would say yes, otherwise move. And other people would say no. So again, if the government is corrupt or tyrannical, or if it's a government you didn't vote for, if you're in a country that votes, if the tax funds are wasted, that's another reason it's been given in the literature. If they just waste the tax funds, why am I giving money to them so they can waste it? Or if you don't receive benefits, if you pay a lot of money to the government but you don't receive benefits, that's another reason it's been given in the literature to justify at least partial tax evasion. And if the tax funds are spent on immoral activities, like tax-supported abortions would be one that might hit home. You know, if you don't like abortions, should you be forced to pay for it? Some people would say yes, if you don't like it, leave. But there's a cost of leaving. You might like the place where you live in general, you just don't like the government necessarily. So those are all reasons that have been given to justify tax evasion, at least sometimes. And there are more. These are just some of the most frequent ones that have popped up in the literature. And in some cases, again, the argument has been made that tax evasion may be a moral obligation. Like if you live in a tyrannical government, there's not only no duty to pay, but you should do whatever you can to not pay, because those funds would be used to pay for tyrannical activities. And again, the unjust war theory, if your country is fighting an unjust war, the arguments have been made in the literature that you have a moral obligation not to pay if you can get away with not paying. And again, the government abortion thing I already mentioned. So now we get to the good stuff. What do Muslims think about the ethics of tax evasion? Well, way back when, before the internet, I went into a library. You've probably seen them, right? They have books, they have journals, and they're in paper. Maybe you've seen photos of them in the History Museum or something. So I went to the place where I used to teach at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. Nice Catholic school, they have a nice Catholic library. And that's where I found the Martin Crowe doctoral thesis in 1944 that gave all those reasons I just mentioned. So I decided I wanted to expand on that to see what other religions had to say about the ethics of tax evasion. And I couldn't find very much at all. One thing I did find was a book by someone called Yusuf. It's 1971. I had to get it through an interlibrary loan. And he had a book on Islamic business ethics. One chapter was devoted to the ethics of tax evasion. And then I found another book by Ahmad, 1995, but all he did was regurgitate what Yusuf said in 1971. They both said exactly the same thing, and this is what they said, basically. The moral obligation to pay depends on the kind of tax that's being paid. Illegitimate taxes, which there's absolutely no ethical duty to pay, would include taxes used to fund illegitimate activities, or indirect taxes, like excise taxes, customs duties, hidden taxes. And again, the reason he gave for that is because taxes should be visible. People should know what they're paying, how much they're paying, where it's going to. And then income taxes, there's absolutely no moral duty to pay income taxes. I like that one the best because it curbs initiative. And curbing initiative is a bad thing, not only under Islam, but under other religions as well. And the taxes, any tax that raises the price, there's no ethical duty to pay those either. Like sales taxes, that raises prices, value-added taxes, tariffs, they'll raise prices. And death taxes, there's absolutely no moral requirement to pay a death tax. And so that's what Yusuf said in 1971, and Ahmed said the same thing in 1995. So that's all I had to go on at the time before the internet. So I started writing articles that mentioned these things. And then in 2011, I got a rather nasty email from an Islamic scholar in the Midwestern United States who said everything I said is wrong. Then it just so happened I was editing a book on the ethics of tax evasion for Springer, publisher, and I invited him to write a chapter, giving his views, explaining why I was wrong, and what the truth is according to his version of Islam. And so he wrote a chapter. His name is Jalili. Maybe some of you know him. In 2012, he contributed a chapter to one of my books. And his view is that tax evasion is always unethical. Oh, you agree with that? Maybe I'll change your mind in the next 10 minutes. We'll see. I'm not arguing for one position anyway. Make up your own mind. I'm just telling you what I read. And the reason he gave was that Allah owns everything. Humans are mere custodians. So in effect, if you evade taxes, you're stealing from Allah. That was his position. However, he deliberately avoided the issue about what do you do if it's a secular state, because he said the rule only applies to countries governed by Sharia law. So what do you do in a country that's not governed by Sharia law? Is tax evasion okay in a case like that? He deliberately avoided that issue. And, why not, right? Because otherwise you're getting into a quagmire, which raises a few questions that he didn't answer, he didn't even look at, perhaps. Is tax evasion unethical in secular countries? He didn't have anything to say about that. So maybe we should go back to 1971 and use that as our guidelines, Yusuf and Ahmed. No, you're saying no? Haven't convinced you yet. What? Okay, yeah. So anyway, and also, what if the evader is a better custodian than government? Again, if we begin with the premise that Allah owns everything, all property is owned by Allah, we then have the choice, who's going to be the custodian of that property? If we pay our taxes, Let me give you an example. The federal government of the United States is the custodian of Allah's property. How do you think about it? How do you feel about that? You know, what does the U.S. government do with that money? It's a rhetorical question. If the evader decides to keep the money for himself or herself, they would spend it on other things that may create jobs. Maybe buy a house, in which case the construction industry benefits. You know, it creates jobs, wealth. If they buy a car, the automobile industry benefits, more employment. If the cars are made out of steel or plastic, or both, those industries benefit. So the question then becomes, who would be the better custodian of Allah's property? The federal government of the United States, for instance, or the evaders who don't pay? It's a question that's unanswered. And another question that's unanswered, again, Jalili says that tax evasion is never acceptable in a country that follows Sharia law. But what if the country that follows Sharia law is also a tyrannical government? Could you have both at the same time? Can you think of a country that is under Sharia law that's also a tyranny? I mean, that's a rhetorical question too. And what do you do then? If there's no obligation to pay to a tyrannical government, but there's also an absolute obligation to pay to a country governed by Sharia law, what is the correct answer? Is tax evasion ethical or not from a philosophical perspective? So that's the summary of my last 25 years of research, pretty much. Again, the real Muslim view. Now, when we get to real Muslims, we're talking not about these theoretical people. We're talking about real live Muslims who breathe and stuff, you know. There are some of you in the room here, actually. What's the real Muslim view? Well, the World Values Survey does surveys every 5 years or so where they ask over 200 questions to over 100,000 people. And in the last survey, they gave surveys to 30,236 Muslims in 69 countries between 2017 and 2022. And they gave them a scale of 1 to 10. Tax evasion is never ethical to always ethical and everything in between. And never justifiable was 64.3%. Always justifiable was 2.6%. And sometimes justifiable was 33.1%. So by about a 2-to-1 ratio, Muslims in 69 countries thought that tax evasion is never justifiable. Again, these people were just living, breathing Muslims. They didn't necessarily have a strong grasp of Islamic philosophy because they were taken from off the streets, you know, different professions. They didn't have much background in Islamic literature for the most part, but this is their opinion for more than 30,000 Muslims. So we have the philosophical view in the literature, and then we have the view that actual people have taken. And there seems to be a divergence there. And that pretty much summarizes 25 years of Islamic research, only in the English language. And which brings me to another thing. I've compiled summaries of prior studies. So if you'd like summaries of more than 100 studies on the ethics of tax evasion, send me an email and I'll give you the summaries. It's more than 100. I think it's 120, something like that. So I've done a lot of work over the years. I've summarized these studies because it makes it easier for me to write papers if I have the summaries right in front of me. I don't have to keep looking at the literature all the time. So I'm willing to share that with you. All you have to do is send me an email to bob414 and I'll send you summaries of over 100 studies, which would take you a long time if you got them on your own. So, and also, if for those out there who like to publish, you have a publishing opportunity as well. The Journal of Accounting, Ethics, and Public Policy is looking for manuscripts on ethics, and they've done over 50 articles on the ethics of tax evasion. I'm the founding editor, by the way. But I'm not the editor anymore. I gave that up as of December 31st because I'm trying to cut down a little bit. But anyway, they've already published over 50 articles on the ethics of tax evasion. So they're very friendly toward that particular topic. And if you have topics on accounting ethics or whatever, even if it's not tax evasion related, send it to them anyway and tell them I sent you. and then there's the jaepp.org is the thing. And that's it. That was almost painless, right? Did I change anybody's mind? Meaning you? No? Yeah, okay. It was worth a shot. Oh, well, yeah. I used to be a tax attorney in Manhattan once upon a time, and I could tell you some of those stories, but that would take hours. So, yeah. So I'm an attorney too, but I don't practice anymore. I'm a CPA, but I don't practice. I'd rather just... Trump? Oh, Trump is completely blameless. He's never done anything wrong. He's never lied to the people. Yeah. Being indicted is not the same as being convicted. Yes?
Have you done any work on the history of taxation in the Islamic world? And the taxation have started, especially the second under Omar?
No, I know nothing about that aspect of it. But you know, you speak fairly passable Arabic from what I've heard.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
definitely.
So you could cut out a little niche for yourself in that area because I have no background in that. I did write something on the history of the income tax in the United States, published by Deakin University in Australia about 30 years ago, before the internet, so it's probably not online.
I did very little research on the taxation under Umar ibn al-Khattab. I'm happy to exchange that knowledge with you.
Yeah. You can introduce that to the English-speaking public because almost nobody, no English speaker, native English speaker, would know anything about that. So that would be a good contribution to the literature.
Thank you so much. I have a query. What should the opinion if the country regulator use the tax in an unethical sector?
I didn't quite understand that.
And what should the opinion? Should be opinion if country regulator use the tax in unethical sector about tax evasion?
What will be the status of tax evasion if the government is using the money for illegitimate reasons?
Oh, well, yeah, it's still illegal, but for, there's a difference between what's legal and what's ethical. Hopefully there's a large overlap, like two Venn diagrams, but they don't have 100% overlap. So some people get persecuted for tax evasion more than others. Like Hunter Biden, for instance, he's evaded taxes and they just forgot about it. The statute of limitations has run and so forth. But if some other people who don't have government connections are guilty of tax evasion, they could get prosecuted. But from a philosophical perspective, we have the jury system in the United States, and America's founding fathers gave us the jury system so that if someone is convicted of a bad law, the jury can say that person's not guilty, even if they are actually guilty. So if a case like that went to court, like if someone who thinks that abortion should not be funded with government money evades taxes, and they go to court and they make that argument. The law says they're guilty, but the jury may say they're not guilty. I don't know if that answers your question, but again, there's a legal answer and there's an ethical answer. Yeah.
You may not know this, but maybe it's a thought-provoking. In Islam, one of the 5 pillars is to pay zakat, which is a religious tax.
Yeah. Well, zakat is a voluntary thing, though, right?
No, it's a religious mandatory. So that means a Muslim living in the United States, so he has a double taxation. He has to pay tax to God, he has to pay tax to IRS.
Which reminds me of something else. In one of the surveys that was done in a Muslim country, one of the main arguments that's been given to justify tax evasion is because they already pay zakat. And the argument was, well, I already paid zakat, I don't have to pay the government. And that was, I think it was in Yemen.
That's the individual level, but in many countries like Malaysia, for example, they have, harmonized this. If somebody pays at the corporation level, not at the...
They call it
No, but at the corporation level, not at the individual level, right? Oh, in Malaysia, so if a person pays zakat, let's say total tax is 100, and he pays zakat 50, he has to only pay 50 to the government. So they harmonize this so that people are encouraged to pay both.
Yeah.
You pay your zakat to a non-for-profit here, it's a tax deduction as well.
In the United States, zakat is voluntary, right? Yeah, so it depends on the country. Yeah. And also, if you're a Mormon, that's one of the kinds of Christian in the United States. If you're a Mormon, they have a religious rule, I guess, that you have to pay 10% for charitable works. You pay it to the church, and then the church distributes it. And so... Yeah. Jesus said, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's." But what is Caesar entitled to? I mean, look at what they did to Jesus, right? They crucified him. So, how much tax should he pay to Caesar? That's just saying. Okay. Yes.
Legitimate or not, and if it is, what kind of taxes should be imposed? And some of the Islamic economists, when they initially talked about the fiscal policy, there was this debate: what should be taxed and what should be the level of taxes, other than zakah, which is compulsory in an Islamic system.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you're talking about tax evasion, which is a question which comes after that, right? So I think there's a lot of literature probably on taxation from Islamic perspective, not a lot, at least more than tax evasion. But very interesting to look at this tax evasion perspective, because ethical rather than a legal issue, right?
Yeah.
Because tax is a legal issue which
it's
a government
it's
can
legal,
impose.
it's ethical.
Yeah.
Could you give a little bit more definition of tax evasion? Are you talking about legal tax loops?
Well, tax evasion is the illegal non-payment of
Okay,
taxes.
I'll make
Tax
sure.
avoidance just means that you're doing everything legally that you can to minimize your taxes.
Right.
Some people say there's a more obligation to pay more than just what you're legally required to pay, because the government is somehow entitled to take money out of your pocket. My own view, I disagree with that. There's actually a Supreme Court case where one of the justices says there's no moral obligation to pay more than what's legally required. I forget which Supreme Court justice said that, but one of them said that. So, yeah.
You just mentioned, that was my question, legally required, is that weighted by so-called government or so-called public? Whose opinion or whose jurisdiction applies to that legal terms that legally obligated to?
Well,
what's the ceiling of it?
Well, that's sort of complicated, because the U.S. Congress passes laws, and there are 3 different federal court systems that interpret the tax law, and the Internal Revenue Service publishes publications that they think has the equivalent of law. Usually it does, but sometimes they're overruled. And so sometimes the tax law is not clear, especially since the 1986 Tax Reform Act. It was bad enough before, but now after that 1986 Tax Reform Act, we still don't know the answer to some of those questions. You just have to do what you think is right, or do what you think you can get away with, and then hope that you don't get audited. So there's some questions in tax law have not been answered clearly. There's no clearly drawn line in some cases about what you should pay a tax on and what you shouldn't, or how much. There's different rates for different kinds of things. Again, if you can classify something as a capital gains, you pay a lower rate, but there are certain things that have to be present, certain requirements. This one company I used to work for, which shall remain anonymous. They deliberately classified hundreds of thousands of dollars of income as capital gains, even though they knew it was not capital gains. They even kept a record of it so that if they got caught on audit, they'd know exactly how much they had to pay.
People just get away with their ideology and ideas, and they make some engineering in the tax payments and in their accounting, and then get away with it. But we, as a civilian citizen, regular people, wouldn't have that kind of so-called expertise or engineering knowledge, and we cannot just do anything about it. We just pay 34%, 39%.
Yeah.
And industry is just thinking we cannot pay our employees, we cannot have enough for our children. So, I mean, why is that? I mean, who will answer those questions, and whom should we ask to?
Well, philosophers can answer the questions, you know. I mean, yeah, there you go. Financial planners. But you have to have an MD degree as well.